Hi everyone, and welcome back to Advanced Tips and Tricks in Configuring File Server Permissions. My name is Ryan Oystacher, and I'm here alongside Greg Shields and Todd Tobias, and we're going to teach about some file server permissions today. So just some general housekeeping about today's webinar is that, remember, we'll be giving away an iPad at the end of the presentation, so make sure you stick around. If you have questions, be sure to ask them in the GoToWebinar console. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible. And a recording will be emailed to you so you can review or share this presentation with coworkers. So a little bit about today's sponsor, Quest Software, is today's sponsor is actually ScriptLogic, which is in the process of integrating with our parent company, Quest Software. Quest was established in 1987 and focuses on 6 core solution areas. Configuring file server permissions falls under the Windows Server Management area, which will be today's focus. So just briefly about today's speaker is Greg Shields is a senior partner and principal technologist with Concentrated Technology. He is a contributing editor for TechNet Magazine and Redmond Magazine and a series editor for Real-Time Publishers. Greg is a sought-after and top-rate speaker and can be seen regularly at conferences like Tech Mentor, TechEd, VMworld, and more. He is a multiple recipient of Microsoft's Most Valuable Professional Award and has received VMware's vExpert Award. Todd Tobias is a product manager with Quest Software, having joined the company in 2007. He has almost 20 years of experience in Microsoft platform management, having successfully managed 5 products focused on AD management, backup and recovery, file server management, migration, and compliance. So with that, I'll kick it off to you, Greg.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Welcome to another one of these presentations where your friends from Quest and ScriptLogic and I get the opportunity to banter about all the fun things that we think of and we see in IT today. Today's presentation, I don't know if I can necessarily say if it's one of the more fun things we have to do. In fact, I would argue that configuring Windows permissions, honestly, it kind of stinks. The entire process of having to deal with permissions these days is just a real nightmare. In fact, it's funny because dealing with permissions has never really, it's never really been a great idea. In fact, the whole activity of dealing with permissions may well just be the bane of every IT professional's existence. I mean, you know the problem. You've got some 80 gazillion different files and folders out there. And on them is probably more than 80 gazillion permissions because, well, you got to have domain admins, you got to have, whoever needs the perm, and there's probably a couple of different groups that need the perm. And when you take all of that, and all the different files and folders, and combine that with all the different permissions that are out there, well, combine that again with the fact that permissioning is managed via, it's really one of Windows' least intuitive GUIs. So for a lot of us, really for all of us, dealing with permissions is kind of a multi-fold annoyance. So you have these tools that are out there that are just, let's just call them, they're just awful. And so Microsoft talks about, hey, we've got all these great other tools that are out there. We've got PowerShell, we've got the command line, we've got iCackles, we have all these other things that are out there. But the command line tools are in many ways just as complex as, well, using the graphical user interface. A lot of times the hard part really is just figuring out where the permissions are and trying to troubleshoot exactly where they are. So the guys from Quest, ScriptLogic, and I have kind of taken the time to break down the whole permissioning activity into really what are its 5 major tasks. So you got to figure out where they are. Okay, where the heck are my perms, and are they correct today? When I find where they are, or when I find where they aren't, I've got to figure out how do I enact change. Okay, how do I go about managing the permissions and doing something in a way that's repeatable? I have to also undo things when somebody goes, whoops, because that tends to happen more often than you'd think. And in fact, because of the visibility problem with permissions, un-oopsing can be a really bad idea. I just noticed that your malware database is outdated by 7 days, so just be careful with those permissions there. migrating is also one of those activities. If you've ever had to do one of those file server migrations where you're on one server, you got a bunch of files and folders on one server, and you have to move them over to some other server because you need a bigger server or you're changing hardware or whatever, replicating permissions from one location to the other can be a real absolute nightmare. And most importantly, too, is just reporting. How you can figure out what you did and how you can know if you left for an hour and came back that somebody hasn't undone whatever you've accomplished. So these are the five, at least as I see it, these are the five kind of major activities that are associated with permissioning these days. And I'll talk here in just a minute about some of the tools that are available, just either free tools or in-the-box native tools that are available for accomplishing some of these tasks. Ryan and Todd will also help you with some of the Quest and Script logic tools that are available to accomplish some of the same things. So I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, so Greg mentioned searching, managing, recovering, migrating, reporting. Well, Quest actually has a solution called Security Explorer that can do all of these tasks for you. Now, throughout today's presentation, Greg's going to show you, these native ways of doing things, and Todd's going to show you how you can do it easier and quicker with Security Explorer. So with that, I'll let you kind of go into the first area then, Greg.
This is always how this gets set up, right? So I'm the one that has to talk about how this stuff really stinks, and you guys get to follow through with, look at all this wonderful, look at all these solutions that make this problem much easier. I feel like I've got the stinky part of this job.
Well, you never cease to make us look good, Greg. I'll tell you that much.
I got the hardest working job in show business right here. Hey, let me ask you a question. All right, so we're talking about permissions, and we're talking about how with bad permissions here that people can do some really awful stuff. And I can imagine, since we've all been IT pros for some period of time, you know that hey, you got all these privileges, right? You're an IT administrator. You can do whatever you want. Have you ever used your privileges for the forces of evil?
I have.
We got one out of two here.
Okay. Are you going to share it with us?
Yeah, why not? I was working for a small firm. You're the domain admin, and so you give privileges out to all your folks, and so you typically make a backdoor for yourself. But unbeknownst to you, someone next to you or a coworker who's very close to you may also know your information too, and so that sort of leaves yourself wide open for compliance problems. And so I sort of ran into that myself when, given too many people admin rights, it sort of negates the whole reason of having a security in the first place.
Back when I used to work for a very large defense contractor here in Denver, we used to joke about creating this IamFired.bat file. And the joke was always how much, how complex could we make the file so that when we were gone, no one would be able to trace it back to us. That was probably as close as I think we ever got to doing something evil, but I don't think I ever actually created the file, but we talked about it. All right, so let's talk about searching. Okay, so on your systems, okay, on your file servers, there are going to be a number of different locations in which permissions get applied. And you can use tools like iCackles, and you can use tools like PowerShell to identify where the perms are. But one of the big problems with a lot of the command line tools for visualizing where permissions are is they're not graphical. Right? It's not really easy for you with a command line tool to get a mental picture of where your perms are. Now, there is a native tool which is called Access Enum that I have possibly the world's worst screenshot of right here. And I guarantee you that if you download Access Enum, it does not look that blurry.
Now, I actually hear that it actually really looks like that. So.
Oh, it does. Okay, I've heard they've updated it to include this new blurry feature. Old Sysinternals tool, been around for a long time. Now, Access Enum is a very useful tool because you point it at a location where you want it to identify what sorts of permissions are at that location, and then in the subfolders of that location, it can tell you where the permissions are different. So kind of in that way, it can give you a good feeling for, well, all right, if I know that I've set the permissions correctly here, well, where sub to that are they different from where they are up here? And that kind of helps with the visualization. It's not a perfect solution, but it is better than trying to run through iCackles and watching pages and pages of screen go by. Now, the challenge here with access enum is the fact that while it can enumerate stuff, right? It's not access fix, it's access enum. And when it goes and enums the stuff, then you actually have to go through a fairly manual process of translating what it enums into something that you're going to resolve. So you've got to have sort of that mapping between the two, which is something that you don't necessarily get with access enum. Now, I'm sure that you guys have a tool that accomplishes that.
So, you talk about searching, Greg, and, with Security Explorer, we make searching for permissions easier. And, I mean, administrators using tools like Access Enum, often get frustrated searching for permissions because, it offers limited information, it's difficult to use, and it doesn't have that flexibility. And I mean, with all these things, it makes it very difficult to find those overprivileged users who might have been given, let's say, local admin rights and were forgotten about. Todd, why don't you show us how you can search for permissions with Security Explorer?
Sure. Let me get out my Swiss Army knife here. No punt there, Greg.
Is that what we're calling the RDP session now?
Yep. So Security Explorer, I failed to mention earlier that when I gave my coworker domain admin rights, he apparently gave other folks administrative rights, and so it sort of got very ugly very fast. And running through Access Enum and iCalcs is nice and all, but I'd rather use a tool that I can granularly search for particular configurations and even pinpoint explicit permissions to various resources. I can search by assignment, by user, by a group, down to that particular file and or folder. And so here with Security Explorer, we sort of make it really easy for you. Just at a high level here, NTFS Security tab, obviously we could talk about other areas, but just for this demo purposes, under NTFS Security here, we can do a variance of other things. We'll get into what those are very shortly. But as far as getting granular and understanding who has permissions to what and where, I can simply click Search, and then I've created these search scopes to give us a little bit easier time here, but I can go and browse out to my environment, or I could just load up a scope that I've already created here, and then I might want to do things like, well, let's find out who in finance has access to certain things. I could also get some granular access to, show me the group memberships, maybe even down to nested groups. So I might want to say, okay, well, who has access to my finance group down to my legal folder on my file server, and I might also want to know my nested groups. This is going to show me a sub-level, a permission level that I really can't get with native tools. So if I go ahead and do a search here, let's give it a second. Now understand that I'm going out to a file server and it's going and enumerating these permissions. Now if I've got many file servers in there, this could take a little bit to pull this up because it is real time. But so notice here I was able to pinpoint exactly the permissions that I have down to folder levels. Notice I even have down to a particular point in here. I can see that my lawyers has access, full control to a particular folder on my file structure. This really helps out in understanding where the permissions are in my organization. Now I can also filter that down to a permission criteria. So maybe I want to say, well, I just want to know who has modify or who has list or execute, read only. And then I can also say, maybe I want to get even more granular to say, is it applied to this file and or folder or just files only? So this really helps me out. Now I can even go one better. Sorry, Greg. By file and by folder and file criteria, I can even add a wildcard. So maybe there's certain files that I'm looking for that have certain permissions tied to them, and this really helps me out in getting a bigger picture as to where my permissions are. Back to you, Greg.
I just don't see the value here. I mean, look, I could probably accomplish this with some 700-800 lines of PowerShell code.
There you go.
Or 800,000, I guess. I don't know. The visualization is really critical. Being able to actually see that stuff is you can't actually manage it unless you actually can see where it's at. So, all right, well, we have tools that are out there to manage things, and once we figure out what they are, well, then we've actually got to go and enact change. Now, one of the big issues is when you go to actually make the permissions changes inside of Windows, there's about 15 little screens that you have to pay attention to. And admittedly, those 15 screens, there's so many clicks that are required for every single permission that you're trying to do that you can kind of get what I call permissions wrist out of it. So if you're trying to avoid permissions risk, where you've got to go see the chiropractor because your mouse hand just isn't working the way it should anymore, there is a command line tool called iCackles that is almost the permissions risk eliminator. In fact, I will argue that Microsoft's permissions UI is in some ways got to be an OSHA violation. You know, it has to be, just because of all the effort that's involved to move around between those screens. And somehow, and I just don't get this, but somehow it's as if every new version of the operating system makes that graphical permissions tool even more complex than it was the time before. Anyway, so here we have this native tool, okay? And let's say that I have a series of folders here. Your classic, you know, your shared drive. And on the shared drive, I've got a finance subfolder, I've got a marketing subfolder, and I've got sub to that some other folders like budgets and metrics, and I've got this restricted folder down there that I have to be careful of. Now, if I use iCackles, there's a relatively complex series of commands that are necessary in order to essentially set a permission. Okay, so you'll see here that I have 4 different permissions that I'm setting. Okay, the first one is iCackles, and I'm going against the C shared marketing folder. I'm turning on inheritance. I am granting the finance users, I believe that's the read bit, although I can't remember what OI and CI stand for. And then file admins the full control. So I think that's object inherit and container inherit are what those two are for. And then after I did that, I went down to product and gave the modify permission to product users, both object inherit and container inherit. And then I apparently misspelled inheritance and then applied it to the restricted folder. So the command line syntax is there built into iCackles to actually accomplish whatever you need to. But as I mentioned, you got to spend a little bit of time kind of understanding what that syntax is.
So, Greg, if we're using iCackles and it's an OSHA violation, are we going to have to post that in our break room at all, or what's the rule on that?
I don't know. It's one of those things where we can actually get something out of that. I don't know.
Well, with Security Explorer, managing permissions isn't a hassle. And one of the things that we hear most about using tools like iCackles is that it's very complicated. It's difficult to change permissions in a short time window. It's not easy to recreate permissions for new users. Access denied errors are a frequent problem. And, it's a pain to edit and view members in various groups. And in general, it just makes it very difficult to give permissions to many users in a timely manner. Todd, why don't you show us how Security Explorer manages permissions?
Sure. I'd much rather show you how Security Explorer does it than continue to get a migraine with iCackles.
Yeah.
Here on one second. Let me switch to my environment here. So I showed you before how easily it was to search for items, but let's go ahead and just really quickly, I just want to show you kind of what Greg was mentioning before. In order for me to get the permissions, I have to right-click, go to Properties, that's 1 click, go to Security, that's 2, then I got to Edit, that's 3, and then I got to Add, that's 4, right? Or if I go to Advanced, I can then change my permissions. So I've got like 5-6 clicks in order to get even a view into what permissions are. With Security Explorer, I simply go to Browse my NTFS security here, and I go and open up a folder that I have out on my I drive here, or L drive, excuse me. And so you can see at a single click, I have access to see all the permissions at the highest level possible. If I drill down into, or select, in fact, different folders, you notice that I have different permission sets listed there. I'll go ahead and make this a little bigger. So you notice here, as I click around, I can see that I have different permissions. Now, I also see my inherited and explicit right off the bat. My inherited is grayed, and my explicit is in color. How do I manage this permissions? Well, it's really easy to do. You can grant, revoke, or clone permissions, and there's quite a couple of different areas where you could do it. Notice on the bottom here, I can grant, revoke, clone, look at the contents, modify, or even delete permissions right here, which is really simple to do. On the right-hand side, there's also a toolbar to do that. But at any location, I can simply right-click on a folder, or a file for that matter, and I can grant, revoke, clone, or I can even use the function key. So we really make it very easy for you to get to these particular functions to enable or, grant or revoke permissions. So if I want to grant permissions, all I have to simply do is grant permissions, and now I'm presented with this interface that I can now select a user. I can go to advanced users here and type in a partial letter. Obviously, we know how to use this. I can select multiple users, and then I select OK. And then here I can control it down to how do I want to apply that? Do I want to apply it either by full control, modify, grant, read-only, list? So, or I can even go into special here and select special types of permissions. You can even do it to an additional extreme where I can say different file folders or subfolders. I don't have to understand or remember what CI or CL means. I can come in here and simply select on it here for those who like a GUI here. And, you know, I can even add it to the user's permission or completely replace that. You know, and there's that little feature we have where you want to override permission. So, you know, you might want to use that with caution, but you can explicitly override permission at a sub-level too. It's as simple as clicking Add, clicking OK, and then my permission is done. That simple. And quite the opposite. So if I wanted to revoke permission, I can then simply select on the object, and refresh here my permissions, and I could simply right-click on an object and then revoke that permission. That's simply just the opposite. So here I can go and select my objects that I want to remove. I can either change their permission or completely remove those from this location. That simple.
Well,
Back to you, Greg.
Well, now what if I like changing permissions and I really enjoy clicking through all these interfaces? I mean, you guys aren't really helping me if it's actually an activity that I enjoy doing.
That's true.
Doesn't sound like a fun activity to me. Not when I have a million other things to do.
I'd rather scrape paint off a wall.
So, all right, well, so we've talked about a single permission here, but what really I think the people that are on this presentation really care about is changing one permission. All right, I can see that, but what if a whole bunch of permissions get misconfigured all at the same time? So everybody knows about the never ever 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 check this box. You know, the one in permissioning, and it's changed its names throughout the years. I believe that these days it's called the replace all child object permissions with inheritable permissions from this object, which arguably might be the worst named checkbox in all of Windows.
That's kind of like a supercalifragilistic.
I think what they ought to put under there is sort of I don't know, some sort of disclaimer. Never, ever, ever check this box unless you mean it, really, or something like that. Because we've all, at some point in our career, accidentally checked that box, or we knew of someone who did, quote unquote, and as a result, an entire set of permissions get completely updated and overwritten with domain users. In fact, that actually happened to me. I didn't do it, and Scout's honor on here. We had a very large permission structure. It looked very similar, well, looked kind of like this, but it was much deeper than that. And because of that permission structure, it was a government program, and so some people needed to see some stuff and other people needed to see other stuff. And we had all the permissions set up really well in there. And then I decided to go on vacation. And somebody at the help desk needed to go change one perm very high up in the tree and accidentally clicked that never, ever, 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 ever check this box and wiped out all the perms. So, darn it, help deskers. Well, my solution at the time was, all right, well, I know now that iCackles can do some nifty stuff. If I can figure out what the iCackles strings are, well, why not take iCackles and then take all of the permissioning items that comprise this folder structure, put them into a text file, and then run that text file as a scheduled task so that once a day it would just simply override all the permissions. And so if I needed to go and make a change, well, all I needed to do was click for step one was document those perms in some sort of scheduled task. And then number two, set up that batch file as a scheduled task to repeat every evening. And number three, just watch it fix everything. So that was kind of what my solution was there. If you flip to the next slide, I'll show you what the 3 steps are there. That was kind of my step, was, all right, we'll start at the top, and we'll break the inheritance, and we'll recreate it, and then step through that tree so that we could essentially create this nice structure for rebuilding the permissions in case we had one of those nasty help desk people make a mistake once again. So what do you think of that plan, huh?
Love it. If you got
Yeah, I mean, if you're willing to take the risk that something like that would work, I know that probably wouldn't work for me. And that brings me to Security Explorer, and you can recover permissions seamlessly. And I mean, what we hear is that administrators are often afraid to use tools like iCackles to recover permissions because, there's just no guarantee that it will work like the way that you need it to. So, it's not a sure way of backing up permissions. There's a strong possibility something will go wrong when recovering those permissions. And, part of the problem, too, is that permissions are often attached to the resource that was deleted in the first place. So, when a server goes down, I mean, it's not worth it for me, but is it really worth it to rely on a native way to recover those permissions? So, with that, Todd, why don't you show us how Security Explorer's recovery feature works?
Sure. I'll go ahead and swap out here to my VM. So with Security Explorer, going back to managing permissions, even if a server should go down or changes are happening throughout the day, it's hard to keep track of things. And so, creating that conglomerate script there and having it scheduled is nice and all, but what if I had a much easier way to not only back up my permissions, but to recover if I should have an issue? A more generalistic and targeted restoration process. So let's just take my legal portion here we've been working on, and I can simply right-click on that and go to my backup. Now, there's an easier way to do things. I can go to tasks also. So notice there's just a quick way to get there. I can backup, restore, and I can even look at my schedule backup. So I'll go ahead and just click on backup here. And this gives me this nice little UI that I can select my path that I want to. I go ahead and grab a file name. I can select my file name there. And then I click OK. That goes out and backs up my security. Now, this is just backing up file security only. This is not backing up any data. So if I go to the UI, this is where I can do it through the UI. Get a little more granular here. So if I select my folder, I could even add multiple paths, and I could browse out to different resources in my environment. So there might be multiple locations. So here I could search out through Active Directory or any other servers that I might have in my domain that I can add in here that I want to back up. So this might be some of your critical locations. And so I can do a backup. I can even include SACLs. I'm not sure if you can even do that with iCalc. Maybe there's certain wildcards that I want to include with certain files. Maybe I don't care about all the files, but I only want to back up permissions on certain types of files in my folder here. I could also schedule that. So if I create, a backup here, I can just go ahead and schedule that out, and this will open up my scheduled tasks basically, and create a scheduled task on that server, and I can control when I want that to happen. Now, what if a disaster happens and I need to restore that? Well, quite simply, it's the opposite way. So I would select Restore. I can go and look at my file, click OK, and then this gives me a nice methodology to restore that. Now, what's nice about this is I can show the differences. So what if maybe some changes happened from the last time I backed up? I can come in here and show the differences. Or maybe I want to include certain files that were in the backup that may have changed. So we're just going to do file path folders in this instance. I could also do things like maybe show me the restore to a different path. Maybe I want to test this out, or maybe I'm doing a file server migration and I want to copy that over to another server, or just a test area for that matter. I could browse out, open this up, and notice the red. This is showing me that there's been some changes in my environment here. So I can basically open this up and see that there's been a change here, and show me the differences. That notice at the top here, finance is not listed there, but below, this is my backed up permission, and so my live permissions show that finance was removed. And so I can really pinpoint where my permissions may have changed, and if so, I can restore this and make that recover quite easily. Back to you, Greg.
You know, my script actually has one value, though. Can you guess what that is?
It takes up time to use, or
it becomes the example of how not to do things.
Yeah.
Fun activity with the kids.
Yeah, fun with old scripts. Let me ask you a question. We kind of talked about this in a previous webinar, but I got to ask you again. What's your favorite RoboCop movie?
RoboCop. Isn't it just RoboCop 1 and 2? I just recently saw RoboCop 1 for the first time, and it was awesome.
I think 1 was the better movie.
Yeah.
And I bring this up again because we are again talking about RoboCopy today. We can't talk about migrating file server permissions unless we talk about RoboCopy because, well, not only do RoboCop and RoboCopy share 7 letters in their names, but more importantly, RoboCop and RoboCopy are pretty much really the only usable native solution that exists for doing a migration. Now, the problem with RoboCopy is the fact that it has a lot of switches. And because it has a lot of switches out there, in fact, there are a redonkulous number, more than can actually fit the screen in here, trying to figure out exactly which of these switches makes sense for what kind of file server migration you're trying to do can be somewhat challenging. Admittedly, I am not actually aware of which switches RoboCop uses, but I know the RoboCopy ones are actually here. Anyway, there are actually some ways in which you can manage those switches. In fact, a complete migration can be done, I believe, with this RoboCopy string here, which is going to copy data, copy the security information. It's going to do a mirror. It's going to set the retries to 0. It's going to set a log file too. But be aware that if you have open files, well, when you attempt to do that migration from one file server to the other, RoboCopy does not really support open files. So it exists, it's there, it can provide that kind of mirroring between 2 servers that's out there, but use at your own risk. So you guys, I'm sure, have a solution.
You know, we do. And I mean, when it comes to migrating permissions, you know, we try to do it without the pain because I think we all know that migrating, you know, in general is just a pain. And, you know, administrators usually hate migrating permissions to a new server just because of the amount of work that's involved. I mean, and using a tool like RoboCopy, it's not easy to migrate the permissions. The SID history often isn't aligned. The destination is frequently bloated with orphan SIDs, and ACLs are almost never aligned. I mean, it makes migrating permissions a tedious and just really time-consuming task. Todd, why don't you show how you can migrate permissions with Security Explorer?
Sure. You know, we do have other solutions available. So you know, you did talk about RoboCopy. So you know, I've got to put a point in here for Secure Copy. You know, it does do data migrations. You know, but it also does the data migration with copying the permission. Now, there's certain instances of why you'd want to use Secure Explorer versus Secure Copy. Obviously, Secure Copy is more of to copy your data. We're talking about migrating permissions at this point. So, you know, Security Explorer is really the way to go when you're talking about migrating permissions because, you know, we talked about backing up those permissions. Now, you know, you back up permissions from a file server, and it could be a file server that failed, or, you know, it's quite simply you're migrating. You're getting rid of an old file server. So you really need to do some things about so cleaning up your orphan SIDs and understanding what's going on there. And so you could, you know, we talked a little bit about searching before, but, you know, you can do that here a little bit easier because now I can search for, let me go ahead and actually go to my tasks here. Notice there's some quick actions that I could do to clean my environment up. You know, when you do data migrations, you're also migrating permissions too. So you want to be careful about what permissions you migrate over. You don't want to just migrate everything because you're taking the bad and putting it into a new environment. You want to take you know, out with the bad in with the good. And so we can do that by some advanced tasks within Security Explorer. Here I can do things like find an unknown account, revoke that unknown account, look for disabled accounts, do things like maybe auto-cloning. Maybe I need to clean up my environment a little bit before. Maybe I need to look at some of the SID history or look at revoke some of the SID information. Now, this really helps me understand what I have in my environment. And I can even do some things like repair security, and then guess what? Back it up, do my migration, and then restore my permissions to that new file server. So that really helps me migrate my information quite easily. And so, you know, really quite once I go to restore, you know, as we saw before, restoring that permission really helps me because then I can take that information there and restore it back to that particular location. And so that really helps with data migrations. It really helps to make it a little bit easier. How about that, Greg?
All right. Number 5 is reporting. And thankfully, we now have a new engine for reporting that's baked into PowerShell, and specifically PowerShell's somewhat powerful compare-object commandlet. Now, the compare-object commandlet, it what it does is it compares two objects in PowerShell. And so what you have to do is sort of ingest in the contents that you want to be compared. Now, you have to be careful here because so there's sort of an open file bug here, and getting around Robocopy's open file feature requires ingesting in that data correctly. And you also got to do a little bit of due diligence there associated with ingesting that data as well. But what you get out at the end of the day is some ridiculous power that you can get all at the command line. So down here on the bottom, what I have is a screenshot from PowerShell that talks about using the compare object commandlet to look at the path between, in this case, a C drive and an E drive. And I'm recursing that path so that I'm getting all the child items and all the contents between those two locations. Now, what's interesting, however, is that the compare-object commandlet it's not entirely fast. As you'll see in this next slide here, there are also some very interesting error messages that you can get if there are problems in the data that's being ingested. It can actually consume a lot of memory because there's a lot of data that has to get put in there, and the sorting algorithm can be very complex and unoptimized in order to do it. And the output requires a little bit of effort, too, to figure out what the difference is between the greater than sign and the less than sign. But if you're okay with all of those options, well, PowerShell and the compare-object commandlet is actually one tool that you can use for figuring out what's different between two different file paths. Guys?
Yeah, that seems like a little too much for me. But with Security Explorer, you do get reporting every step of the way. And I mean, one of the biggest things that administrators tell us is that they hate using command line tools to generate reports just because of the overall complication involved. I mean, you can't easily export data to a usable format. It's very difficult to pull insights like finding security weaknesses from the data. And in general, it just takes a while to pull the reports that administrators need. With command line tools, you just don't have the visibility you need into permissions. Todd, why don't you show us some of the reporting features on Security Explorer?
Sure. I think just going through the product and showing you the security just at a granular level and browsing out. The fact is I can see what my permission is set here at the highest level possible. But what if I needed to look at more? There's a need, obviously, for compliance purposes, internal policies to be met. You need to make sure that you have your permissions proper, and so Secure Explorer is the way to do it. So under my all management tasks here, there's a report section. Notice we have reports for every aspect that Secure Explorer handles. So I can run formatted reports across all these technologies, but again, we're sort of focusing on file server here, so I'll go ahead and select that. Here I can generate a report, and I simply select my location. So here I'll go ahead and select the location here, select OK, and then I'll select OK. So this goes out and builds my report in seconds versus, I don't know how long Greg mentioned there. I sort of dozed off there when he was talking about how long it takes to run a report, but I just ran this report in a matter of, I think, 2 seconds. And so here I can see the permission level, what account, whether it's allow or deny, the owner, even down to where it applies and what container is it protected, or even down to inherited permissions. And so this really gives me a high-level view, even a granular level view as to what my permission is. Now, what's nice about this is I can export it down to many different file formats. I could also email this out to any individual I need. And once I'm done with this, I can even go back into the product. Now, for those that like graphical access, I can even go into my location here and export this out, this permission. So if I wanted to export it out, I could even use this export tool to maybe get a little bit more granular, or maybe I'm even using Microsoft Excel and I want to kick this off to Excel or Access database. Maybe I've got a little Access database that I'm still playing around with, and so I can schedule this out too. If I want to here, I can schedule this out as a task, generate a report. Now that same report that you saw there, I can have a scheduled task, and I can have that drop into a folder whenever I need to. I think that's pretty powerful there. What do you think, Greg?
I'm beginning to think that all these webinars are just a setup for me.
Entrapment.
That's right.
Yeah, it's like entrapment. Come on, show us how to do this in the native tools. And then when I try to figure out how it works, then you guys come out and go click, click, click. Here it goes. So from my perspective, there has to be a better way. Some of these tools that are out there, they are there. I mean, you can build your own PowerShell scripts to do it. You can build your own command line scripts with iCalculus to accomplish that. They're completely available in the native solution, but when you're trying to figure out where stuff is, how to make changes to stuff, how to recover when somebody says oops, how to migrate, the whole migration activity in and of itself is a big challenge. And then really to report, there really needs to be other tools that will help you, particularly when your size of your environment begins to scale. And I'm sure that Ryan has a better way for all of these solutions.
And we do, and really the answer is, Security Explorer. It searches, manages, recovers, migrates, and reports, and it just doesn't, permissioning doesn't just stop at file servers. Administrators need to manage permissions on Exchange servers, SQL servers, SharePoint, services and tasks, and actually Security Explorer can do all those items. We focus mostly on file servers today, but I just want everyone to know that Security Explorer can manage across Exchange, SQL, SharePoint, services, and tasks. And it's really great for that. So if you're interested in downloading a free 30-day trial of Security Explorer, you can go to www.scriptlogic.com. And with that, we're going to get ready to pick our iPad winner. So let's see. And the iPad winner is Robert Block. So Robert, if we'll reach out to you with information on how you can receive your iPad. Thanks so much for attending. We do have some time, so we're going to go into some Q&A. Looks like we have about at least 15 minutes to go into some Q&A about Security Explorer. Greg, thank you so much for being a part of this webcast. You were great as always, and thank you, Todd. And with that, Todd, I got the questions module open right here. You want to answer some of these questions that are on here?
Sure, I'm going to take a look. All right. Let's see. So there's a couple of questions on there quite interesting. Is there an undo button or a, oh no, I clicked this and I shouldn't have? Well, there is the ability to go back right away. So if you have a backup scheduled, it's quite nice because if my backup is scheduled from the day before, or depending on how you have your scheduled tasks backed up, I could at any time go right back to my backed up file and restore that permission. Obviously if it's multiple locations, I don't want to go and manually go look for that. But if I have my backup file, I could simply restore that right away. And so let's see what else we have here. Let me look here more, see if we got any more. It's not working with me today. And if I don't get to your questions, answer your questions today, we'll get back to you as well. And there was a question about, are there any concerns when DFS is being used? Quite honestly, no, because we don't really depend on that. Security Explorer really just depends on the underlying operating system. So if you can access that resource, then we can manage that permission. So even if it's a file server or a net filer, a NetApp for that matter, we can access those permissions. As long as it's emulating NTFS, that's not a problem.
And real quick, some of you are asking if you're able to share this presentation. I just want to remind everyone that we'll go ahead and get a recording over to your email address so that you can share it with anybody in your organization that you feel could benefit from the presentation. All right. Well, with that, sorry we couldn't get to all the questions today, but thank you so much for attending our webcast today, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.